Hey everyone, welcome back to another tier list. I am very excited about this one. Today we're going to be taking a look at the legendary English vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and composer Robert Wyatt. He's another musician that I discovered a little bit later in life, but I've always been somebody who's very attracted to unorthodox sounding music, and I always love stuff that utilizes more unusual, unexpected chord changes and really colorful chord voicings and melodies, and songs that take a lot of wild and unexpected turns. And when I first discovered Robert Wyatt through the Rock Bottom album, it was some of the coolest, most original music that I had heard in a long time, and immediately upon hearing it, I was like, okay, I need to dive into this guy's discography more and discover all of the great stuff that he's done over the years and learn more about him. So that's what I did. And it's been an incredible journey getting to hear all of this great music for the first time and continuing to listen to it and dissect it and find more and more interesting stuff within it. So I'm a relatively new listener to Robert Wyatt, and I may not have as much info as some other people who have been fans of his for decades. So if I get any information wrong or if I miss any key details about any of these albums throughout this that you think are important to mention, please feel free to correct me in the comments. And I gotta say, this list was very difficult to make. I was very torn with a lot of the scorings for a lot of the albums, and I really needed to give each album a good handful of listens to really finalize my thoughts on each of them. And, I redid this list over and over for about a month, and then I think I finally settled on my rankings. So I'm going to share that with you guys. So what we're going to do is go through all 8 of his studio albums from The End of an Ear up to Comic Opera. And I'm going to be excluding his compilation albums and his EPs. I'm just going to do studio albums. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. And I'll walk you through my thoughts and talk a bit about each album. And obviously, these are all just my subjective opinions, and it's impossible to please everybody with these lists. So I know that I'll have some takes that you agree with and maybe a few that you disagree with as well. But obviously, I respect your opinion, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well as your rankings of each album. So please let me know in the comments and let me know what you agree with and what areas you may think I might be missing out on something. And yeah, that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, we'll start out with his debut studio album from 1970 titled The End of an Ear. At this point, Soft Machine was in a very fractured state, and their most recent album, titled Third, had gotten a great reception, so CBS wanted to see if they could ride out that success a little more, and they offered each member of the group a chance to record their own solo album, which led to this first release under Robert's name. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to give this one a C. I've always had a bit of a harder time with this album. It's much different from everything that follows it. This one takes a much more experimental, avant-garde, free jazz sort of approach. And obviously, this was the only album that Robert released before his terrible accident that left him paralyzed. And that caused a significant shift in his songwriting from that point on. So musically, I think it's much different from everything else in his discography, and from a compositional standpoint, his approach was completely different on this as well, because up to this point he had primarily been a drummer, and this album does have a lot of really awesome moments, but as a whole, I do have to be in a very specific mood to listen to it, and I do find some parts of it to be a bit challenging. And for me, personally, this album doesn't have the same replay value that a lot of his other works do. And I know some people gravitate more towards this side of Robert's writing, especially if you're into some more of the experimental and free jazz elements that we got from Soft Machine. But I prefer his writing style on the succeeding albums more, where we get more structured songs with melodies and vocal parts as well as lyrics. Robert's beautiful lyricism was another thing that initially really attracted me to him, and on this album we don't have any lyrics, and all of the vocal work on it consists of different types of sung notes with a variety of vocal experimentations. On this album, we have 7 originals as well as an arrangement of a Gil Evans piece that's divided up into 2 parts, beginning and concluding the album. Instrumentation-wise, Robert is doing drums, piano, organ, bass, and harmonica all himself, and he is utilizing multi-tracking to layer the parts on top of each other. My favorite track on here is probably To Caravan and Brother Jim, which is probably the song that has the most clear harmonic structure, meaning that it has a chord progression that gives us a clear tonal center, and I really love the over the bar line 7/4 groove with those dissonant piano parts overlapping on top of it. Very cool writing. I also really enjoy the track To Carla, Marcia, and Caroline. The piano work on that one is beautiful, and I think that song gives us a little taste of what's to come in the following albums. And the organ and dissonant piano parts layered on top of each other is very interesting. I also really enjoy the vibe of To Mark Everywhere. Very cool groove, and I love the dissonant horn parts on top. Definitely gives me an early 70s avant-garde jazz sort of feel. And some of the tracks in here that I find a bit more challenging are To Oz, Alien, David, and Gilly, as well as To Nick Everyone, and To the Old World. So like I said, I do think there are some very cool moments throughout this album, but I do need to be in a very specific mood for a good handful of these tracks, but I do appreciate Robert's willingness to experiment and mold together so many different kinds of sounds and styles throughout the album. But I think that from his next album onward, the shift that he made in his compositional style was a significant improvement, and that's the style that initially got me so intrigued by Robert's music and made me want to explore him more, whereas this album sounds like a different artist going at the writing with a completely different approach from the Robert Wyatt that we have a few years later. So not a terrible album, but not one of his best works in my opinion, so yeah, I'm going to give this one a C. Okay, next we have his second studio album from 1974 titled Rock Bottom. Obviously, I'm going to give this one an S. That's a no-brainer. Absolutely mind-blowing album, and a lot of big events happened in the years leading up to this album that we need to cover. So at this point, Soft Machine and Matching Mole had broken up, leaving Robert to his own devices, trying to figure out the next move forward. And musically at this point, he had started making the transition from drummer to singer, from his vocal contributions he did with Soft Machine and Matching Mole, as well as a soundtrack that he did in 1973 for a film titled Solar Flares Burn for You. But Robert's frame of mind was still very much in band mode and not really thinking as a solo artist, and there were plans at a certain point in 1973 to do another Matching Mole album with a revamped personnel, which was going to be his next undertaking, but that never ended up happening. And then on June 1st, 1973, something happened that would drastically alter everything in Robert's life. Robert went to a birthday party with his soon-to-be wife, Alfie, at the flat of a landlady friend of theirs, and as the night went on, Robert got more and more drunk to the point where he fell out of a fourth-floor window, landing on his left heel. And it's unclear if it was deliberate or not from varying explanations of how it was told over the years, but from this fall, he ended up being paralyzed from the waist down and would end up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And apparently after the accident, he really had a shift in his philosophy and he really tried to make the best out of it rather than responding to it with anger and resistance, which is amazing and really inspiring on his part. So obviously one big change that had happened was that Robert was no longer able to play drums, which was going to change his approach to songwriting significantly moving forward. And a quote from Robert about how he wanted to approach it was that he said, "I wanted to do something just as well as I could before, but different." So while Robert had started recovering in the hospital from his accident, he started messing around on the piano in the visitor's room and started working out some of these songs that he had written recently on A Trip to Venice with Alfie, and that would eventually lead to this album. And even though these songs were written before his accident, I still think that the circumstances presented created such a big shift in his approach to songwriting and really changed the trajectory of everything that he put out from that point on. So now he has shifted into a solo artist rather than a drummer from a few different bands. And he had been freed up in a lot of ways as well in terms of limiting the amount of instruments that he can use, but now giving him more time to focus on them and really explore them and allowing him to write music that didn't need to be recreated live as well, which I think was one of the ultimate key shifts that define the uniqueness of his music. Obviously, he did perform a lot of these songs live at a certain point, but that wasn't the intention when these songs were being recorded. And also at this point, Alfie begins to take a much more active role in the process and contributes greatly in a variety of musical ways, as well as taking over as his manager and doing the amazing album artwork for every album from this point forward. And they also get married, and their musical partnership shifts into much more of a husband and wife team. In terms of instrumentation on this album, Robert is sticking almost exclusively to vocals, piano, and organ, with the exception of a few percussion parts here and there. And the overall mood of the album is very spacey and very dark and intense throughout a lot of it, but there's also this element of love to it as well, and in a lot of senses, it's a very emotional commentary on his connection with Alfie. And to her credit, she stayed with him after that fall and has been with him ever since, so they really do have a beautiful story and an amazing connection. We have some awesome production on here as well from Nick Mason of Pink Floyd, and Nick even regards this as one of the most satisfying bits of production that he's ever done. And it does have that spacey ambient aesthetic that Pink Floyd has, but it also has that highly adventurous and unpredictable sense of melody and harmony that is very distinct and unique to Robert. And this will be the first of numerous albums that Robert will release that feature a wide variety of different guest artists on it as well. It opens up incredibly strong with Sea Song, and right from the opening chord progression, you know that this is going to be an adventure. It starts out with this beautiful chord progression on the Riviera organ, a sound that will be a distinct part of this album, and then it just weaves into this really dark, eerie segment in the whole tone scale, which changes the mood significantly. And then the vocals enter, and we have this amazingly unique and complex love song with these very emotional lyrics and a very eerie backdrop underneath it within the chord progression. We also have a great feature on bass from Richard Sinclair on this track. And in my opinion, this is the best opening track of any of his albums. When I first heard this, it had me completely gripped, and I was just on the edge of my seat wondering what was going to happen next. And I really love the change that it makes in the last 2 minutes of the track. So heart-wrenching, and Robert's vocal scatting has so much passion and heart behind it. And listening to it and just thinking about the experience that he went through and how he came out on the other side, it could just bring tears to your eyes. Then the album continues with A Last Straw, a very intense and hard-hitting track that has a great energy to it, and it's a great follow-up to the opener. Really beautiful harmonic movements in the piano. It has a lot of chords that are very dark and mysterious, but then it will have these other movements that get slightly brighter, but then go back to that dark foundation of the song. Really amazing contrast. And we also have some great guest features on here as well, with Hugh Hopper from Soft Machine doing a really great driving bass line, as well as Laurie Allen doing an amazing drum groove. After that, the energy picks up even more with track 3, titled Little Red Riding Hood Hit the Road. This song has such an amazing build to it. We have these really intense trumpet parts from South African trumpeter Mongezi Feza, with this really driven percussion going on underneath it, as well as these great unorthodox vocal samples of Robert sprinkled throughout the track. It builds so nicely, and when Robert's vocal melody finally enters, it just feels so satisfying and it hits so hard. And some of the lyrics do seem to be commenting on his feelings about how his accident has affected Alfie and how he has regrets about it. So it's very intense and a very powerful song. And at this point, we're halfway through the album, and we've just been hit with so much beauty and emotion and intensity, and it just keeps on coming. The second side opens up with Alfie B. The first half of the song is very spacey and ambient, with a really nice bass solo from Hugh Hopper. And then the second half changes to a more dark chord progression with this slow, beautiful vocal melody over it. And the lyrics are sort of hard to decipher, but it has something to do with him expressing his love for Alfie in some way. And I really love the change of pace that this song brings to the album, because track 2 and 3 are just so intense, and this is a really nice spot to bring things down a bit and mellow out. And this song segues beautifully into the second Alfie-inspired track on here, titled Alfie E. This one takes a much more ominous and dark sound, very eerie piano and organ parts, and some very intense saxophone work from Gary Window. And at the end of this track, we have this segment where Alfie is speaking, and once again, it's sort of hard to interpret the exact meaning behind a lot of these lyrics, but it seems to me that the Alfie segment is giving Robert the reassurance that she's always going to be there for him and be a supportive figure to him. And she concludes the song with the very powerful line, "I'm not your larder, I'm Alfie, your garter." Very emotional words and a really amazing way to set up the final track of the album, titled Little Red Robin Hood Hit the Road. A very powerful conclusion to the album. It starts out with this awesome snare drum pattern with these spacey organ chords underneath it with a beautiful vocal melody. And we get this amazing guitar feature from Mike Oldfield as well. and the song builds up really beautifully for about 3 minutes, and then it subtly segues into this incredible, beautiful improvised viola section from English musician Fred Frith, with this beautiful spoken word done by Scottish poet Ivor Cutler. Such a beautiful and heartwarming end to a very emotional and tear-jerking album. This album just brings you through so many different moods, and every time I listen to it, I feel like I've gone through just another very intense and powerful musical journey. So I can't say enough good things about this album. So no surprise, this one easily gets an S. Okay, next we have Robert's third studio album from 1975, titled Ruth is Stranger Than Richard. I'm going to give this one a B, and this is one of my scores that I think a lot of people will disagree with. I know a lot of people hold this album in high regard, and I don't think it's a bad album, but I wouldn't say that it's one of his stronger works. It's the follow-up to Rock Bottom, and I think part of the problem is that the bar was set so high after Rock Bottom, and it's almost an impossible act to follow. I do enjoy a lot of this album, but I also don't think that it reaches the highs that Rock Bottom did, and I feel like the overall mood on this album isn't as coherent and solidified. It seems to be a little bit more scattered, more so on side A than side B, but the contrast, I think, can feel a little all over the place, in my opinion, but it is certainly a unique and adventurous album that does have a lot of great moments. The album is split up into two different parts. Side A is Ruth, which are arrangements of other people's music, and Side B is Richard, which features originals of Robert's as well as compilations with English musician Fred Frith, and also an arrangement of a funeral instrumental piece. For me, Side A is what bumps this album down a bit, particularly with the first two tracks, Soup Song and Sonia. I find both tracks to be kind of underwhelming in comparison to everything else on the album, particularly with Sonia. To me, that song has always felt kind of draggy, but Soup Song does have some very cool piano work on it, which I do enjoy, but stylistically, those first two tracks are so different from the opening to Rock Bottom, and for me, the album doesn't really start to pick up momentum and sound more familiar to Rock Bottom until track 3, Team Spirit. I really love that song, and I think that really starts to pick up the momentum on the album a bit. And then track 4 is nice as well. It's an arrangement of a song by bassist Charlie Hayden titled Song for Che, a nice ballad with a very catchy, pretty melody, and a nice follow-up to the intensity of Team Spirit, and that is the conclusion of side 1. So not a bad side, but I think stylistically it's kind of all over the place, and I would have preferred to hear more originals from Robert as opposed to these arrangements of other people's works, with the exception of Soup Song, which was written by Robert and Brian Hopper. But then when we get to side B, I think it really improves significantly. The mood changes to a much darker tone, more similar to Rock Bottom, and I absolutely love the way it opens up with Muddy Mouse A, which was a collaboration with Fred Frith. A song like this is everything that I love about Robert's sound. It's got that beautifully bizarre and mysterious piano part with this really catchy but unorthodox vocal melody, something that I think Robert is just a master of. And the same type of progression comes back on two more tracks on this side with Muddy Mouse B, as well as the closing track Muddy Mouse C. Once again, both collaborations with Fred Frith, and I like how they used this as a recurring theme. Very pretty and very effective. And we also have Solar Flares, which is a nice feel-good instrumental with really beautiful vocal work and a nice ostinato bass line being doubled in the bass clarinet. For me, I think the last two tracks are really the peak of the album with that funeral instrumental that I had mentioned titled 5 Black Notes and 1 White Note. Instrumentally, the song sounds so unique and interesting, very loose and spacey with the drums using brushes, and we have this amazing guitar and synth work that Brian Eno did on this. One of my favorite songs to vibe out to, and another great collaboration on the album. And then after that, the album ends beautifully with Muddy Mouse C. It starts out with the theme from Muddy Mouse A and B, and then it blends into another song called Muddy Mouth. Absolutely gorgeous song with amazing piano work and really beautiful vocal melodies, and a great contribution from Fred Frith. I really love the note work that Robert does at the beginning half of this song, similar to what he does in the ending section of Sea Song on Rock Bottom. I'm not sure if he improvises those vocal melodies when he does them or if he writes them ahead of time, but I really love the work he does around those chord progressions. And I think this is the perfect track to conclude the album. It ends it on a nice, strong, high note. And like I said, I do enjoy the majority of this album, but I do think there are a couple of tracks that I could have done without. But all in all, I would say it's a good album, and although it doesn't reach the highs that Rock Bottom does, I do think that it is an improvement from The End of an Ear, and it does have some really amazing moments, particularly on side B. So I'll give this one a B. Okay, next we have his fourth studio album from 1985 titled Old Rotten Hat. There's been a 10-year gap from his previous release up to this point, and within this time span, Robert had done a variety of compilations and contributions with a bunch of different artists, such as Brian Eno, Nick Mason, and Elvis Costello, as well as doing some singles of different cover songs and a few short LPs and some film soundtracks, but he didn't release any full-length albums under his own name in this whole 10-year period. A good chunk of his time during this period was spent reading a wide variety of different political books with Alfie and doing a lot of research on all things political, foreign and domestic, as well as becoming politically involved and eventually joining the Communist Party of Great Britain. And after the release of Ruth is Stranger Than Richard, Robert had grown tired of the state of the record industry, and he ended up doing more work with an indie label called Rough Trade Records, which was actually set up as a cooperative and was done in a socialist model without any structure of a hierarchy, which was obviously much more in line with his political beliefs. He had found it much harder to put out music as a leader, and he had a much easier time working with other people, but eventually some of the music that he was listening to from some of the South American revolutionaries had inspired him to combine his passion for politics and foreign policy with music, which would eventually lead to the release of this album. So in terms of what I think of this album, I think it's very good and a very strong return album after this long gap. I'm going to give this one an A. This one was one that I struggled with. It was right on the cusp of getting an S, but the more I thought about it, I thought A would be a more fitting scoring, at least in my opinion. On here, we've got all originals, and all of the instruments are being done by Robert, and this is by far his most politically charged album to date as well. It opens up with an incredible track titled Alliance, which has this very pretty, haunting, descending chord progression with this beautiful, catchy vocal melody, where he is commenting on the betrayal that he felt from the Social Democratic Party. Such dark, powerful lyrics, and in my opinion, after Seasong, I think this is the second strongest opening track of any of his albums. I just love the way that it brings the album in on such a dark, eerie note. And then we continue with The United States of Amnesia, another very powerful track that is mocking the United States and their colonialism of the Native Americans. Very intense lyrics, and I imagine that this had to be a very edgy song to write in 1985, so I appreciate how daring he is throughout this album. And I really love the layering of the vocals on this, as well as the use of the synth bass. I believe it's a synth bass anyway. I couldn't find a ton of information about the instrumentation on this album, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But that synth bass is a very distinct sound to this album, in my opinion, similar to how the Riviera organ is very distinct to Rock Bottom. And then track 3 takes an interesting turn with a track called East Timor, a song with very few lyrics, but it is bringing up the conflict between East Timor and Indonesia. And this has always been one of the tracks in here that I was never that crazy about. Not a bad song, but I do find the vibe and the energy of it to be a little underwhelming compared to most of the other stuff on here. And then after that, we have an instrumental titled Speechless. A cool track and a nice breather. I think putting an instrumental in at this point was a good move because the first 3 tracks all have such intense lyrical matter, and this track feels like a nice little breather that you can just vibe out to before the second half of the album. And then we have The Age of Self, another amazing, powerful commentary on the fragmentation of the different factions within the left and his fear of the disintegration of the working class, and he's articulating how fragile their movement felt. And, he says in the lyrics, they are like castles built on sand. And I have very similar thoughts to this track that I did about Alliance. Very beautiful, dark chord progression, very catchy vocal melody, and once again, that synth bass really drives the song, and I think this song with this vibe is placed perfectly in the center of the album. This always feels like the pick-me-up track to me when I'm listening to the album. And then we bring things down a bit again with Vandalusia, and believe it or not, this might actually be my favorite track on this album. I know that's random, but for whatever reason, the more I listen to this song, the better it gets, and it has some of the most unique chord movements of any Robert Wyatt song, in my opinion, and I just love the way that the vocal melody just glides right over and hits these really dark and mysterious intervals against the chords that he's playing. A song like this is like the epitome of what I love about Robert Wyatt from a musical sense. Just such an amazing track. Then after that, we have The British Road, which is now mocking British imperialism, and I like this song. Very cool bass line, and I love the unison lines between the vocals and the keyboard. One thing about this song for me personally is that I do think it is a little too long and starts to drag a bit, but I do think it is a good song. And then we have a really fascinating track called Mass Medium, which is commenting on the dishonesty of the press and the fake promises of freedom that's made by politicians. And this song has always been very interesting to me because if you don't pay attention to the lyrics, it has this very sweet element to it with the music box at the beginning and a very pretty vocal melody with these harmonies that almost remind me of something that you would hear in a jazz standard. So this has always been another one of my favorites from the album. And then after that, we have a track which I very well might pronounce this wrong, but I think it's pronounced Garbzadigi, which is an Iranian term for Westmania. And this song has a really great build to it with awesome piano parts and a really nice contrast between the two sections. The first section is a little bit more upbeat and laid back with more of a feel-good vocal melody, and then the second section turns into this really intense ascending chord progression with these really dark harmonic movements and a very beautiful and hard-hitting vocal melody. I especially love how they extend that section for the last 3 minutes of the song. So intense and so powerful, and a perfect way to give us something really aggressive and hard-hitting before the last track, which is titled PLA, which really brings things down a bit. It stands for Poor Little Alfie, and it has that same sweet element that Mass Medium has with the music box in the intro, and a beautiful vocal melody and chord progression, with obviously the lyrics being about Alfie. And it's the only track that doesn't contain any political subject matter, with the exception of the instrumental, obviously. And I really like this as the concluding track because we get so much intense subject matter and so many really deep, hard-hitting moments, and it's nice to be able to have a nice, peaceful concluding track about Alfie, who has been such a big part of Robert's life. And yeah, I just think this is a great closer. So in general, I think this is a very strong album, and it's definitely an improvement from Ruth is Stranger Than Richard, in my opinion. I do have a few issues on here that I already mentioned, which is probably the main reason why I bumped this down to A. But it was a very hard choice, and like I said, I struggled with this one a lot, probably more than any of the other albums, because it really was on the cusp of getting an S. But yeah, those are my thoughts on this one. So this one will get an A. Okay, next we have the fifth studio album from 1991 titled Donde Están, which is derived from the Spanish term Donde Están. In the years following Old Rotten Hat, Robert and Alfie had moved from Twickenham to Louth, and once again he did a variety of collaborations over this 6-year period before making another record under his own name. But this move to a new location freed him up more and allowed him to have more alone time and incrementally write more stuff, which eventually culminated into this album. And I'm also going to give this one an A. This is a very good album, and it has a lot of similarities to Old Rotten Hat in the sense that it's all originals. Robert is doing all of the instruments himself, with the exception of a collaboration from Hugh Hopper on the final track, as well as Alfie contributing lyrics to 5 of the tracks on here, which was a very nice addition that we hadn't seen before. And a lot of these lyrics were derived from diary entries that Alfie had wrote during their 2 visits to Spain. And once again, the subject matter is very political. And one thing I should mention is that this album actually got re-released in 1998 as Donde Están Revisited, with a new mix and a different track order due to the fact that the original was mixed and released in a rushed fashion. So as I go through the track listing, I'm actually going to be doing it from the 1998 version. It opens up very similarly in subject matter to the opening of Old Rotten Hat with CPGBs, the title being derived from the CPGB, and it's another track doing commentary on the split within the left. Great piano work combined with the Riviera organ very tastefully, and I love the percussion with the brushes on the snare drum and the great cymbal work. Very beautiful vocal melody as well, and just a really nice opening track to the album. And then after that, we have New Information Order, another political track that is attacking conservatism and the idea of privatizing everything and basically just trying to put a price tag on everything and exploit every element of the earth for profit. This song is really amazing, and it really takes its time and stretches out, but the chord progression is absolutely fascinating. It takes so many interesting, colorful turns, and Robert's beautiful vocal melody just glides over the harmonies effortlessly. Great bass line too, it really adds some power to the song. And then the song wraps up with this really dark chord that gets held out and it carries over into the next track, which is the title track, Donde Están. And this song is amazingly eerie because, once again, it's talking about very intense subject matter, the Israel-Palestine conflict, but he's singing about it with this really goofy, upbeat vocal and piano melody with this very lively brush groove in the snare drum, and it creates this really dark, almost frightening sort of mood and contrast, and I really love the placement of this track. It's a good little burst of energy after the first two slower tempoed tracks. And then we go to Sight of the Wind. Musically, this song is very cool, very minimalist with only two chords repeating over and over, but the backdrop features this beautiful reversed vocal sound with more great piano and organ mixtures with a wide variety of instruments being layered throughout. The vibe of this song has always reminded me of something that Pink Floyd would do, and this is the first track to feature Alfie's lyrics, and you can really see the difference in their writing style in the sense that Alfie's is much more about painting an image and using symbolism for the listener to sort of create their own images in their mind, whereas Roberts is much more direct and just straight to the point about what he's talking about, and I think they balance each other out beautifully in terms of the way that they approach lyrics. And then after that, we have Shrink Rap, which showcases Robert's influences that were happening with rap music, with the fast-paced singing. Very cool lyrics on Alfie's part within this one as well. Very great, unique word combinations, and it lent itself really great to that faster singing style. I love the reversed sound that's used as the centerpiece of the beat, too. It adds a really eerie element to the song. Then the album continues with Catholic Architecture, which is a really nice change in mood. The album has been pretty dark up to this point, and this track has much more of a peaceful, serene sort of mood, and it gives us a nice change of pace. To me, this is the standout track of the second half of the album. Very beautiful song. After that, we continue with Worship, another track that is much less dark in comparison to the first 5 tracks. This one has a really catchy, pretty vocal melody with a great chord progression in the piano, and I'm not 100% sure what the lyrics are about, but it seems to be something along the lines of two nuns that are at a beach together, and one of the nuns is more flawed while the other one is much more committed to her beliefs, and the flawed one ends up sinking into the sand while the staunch one stays standing. Very pretty song. And then after that, we have Costa, the final track to feature lyrics from Alfie. And this one goes back into a much darker mood with these drones that are held out with these pitch-bending notes on top of it that almost has an Indian sort of sound. Another song that lyrically is very much painting an image through her words, all centered around the color orange and using it to symbolize a few different things. And I will say, this is probably my least favorite track on the album. I wouldn't say it's a bad song, but I do think that the momentum does die down a bit whenever I get to this track. After that, though, the energy does come up nicely with Left of Man, another political piece where Robert is expressing his despair of the new Labour Party taking over the left and talking about how there is no middle ground when it comes to the left and right issues in politics. And I really love this song. I think it has a really great energy to it, a great bass line, awesome vocal melodies and harmonies. And I love how it ends by dropping out the percussion and going into that dark, mysterious chord in the organ, which segues beautifully into the final track, Lisp Service. A very powerful and intense track to conclude the album, and this is the track that features Hugh Hopper from Soft Machine, who contributed the melody and the music while Robert wrote the lyrics. And the track is basically an apology about U.S. foreign policy and more of a commentary on the hypocrisy of the United States and their imperialism and how once they got what they wanted from it, they went around telling the rest of the world that they can't behave in the same fashion. A very dark conclusion to a predominantly dark and intense album that's balanced out with a couple of more feel-good tracks, as well as the contrasting lyricism that's given by Alfie. So a very good album, very similar to Old Rotten Hat in many ways, and I think that I do like Old Rotten Hat slightly more, but by a very thin margin. I just think that that album reaches a few more highs than this one does in terms of intensity and energy, but this is a very close second and a very solid album, so I will give this one an A. Okay, next we have the 6th studio album from 1997 titled Sleep. In the years leading up to this album, Robert had gone through one of the deepest depressions of his life, and he had a large chunk of time where he was completely inactive and was suffering from insomnia and sleeping very little. And then at one point, Alfie had talked him into trying antidepressants and getting therapy, and it actually did improve his condition significantly to the point where he was able to start writing again and getting creative, which would lead to this album. And I'm going to give this one an S. This is a really amazing album. It was recorded in Phil Manzanera's studio, as would be every future album from this point on as well. And this album has some similarities to Rock Bottom and Ruth is Stranger Than Richard in a sense that there are much more collaborations going on again, and a wide variety of different musicians being featured, such as Brian Eno, Evan Parker, Phil Manzanera, Paul Celler, and many more. The subject matter that's covered in a lot of these songs is much less political from the previous two releases, and it features a lot more personal subject matter. It opens up on a more groovy and feel-good vibe with Heaps of Sheep. Very cool instrumentation on this track. I really love the keyboards and the sequences that they use. And this song is Robert talking about his battles with insomnia, which he had been going through leading up to this album, and he's telling the story through the act of counting sheep. A very strong opener, and a big contrast from the openers on Donde Stan and Old Rotten Hat, which was a nice, pleasant change of pace. Then we continue with The Duchess, a very fascinating song about Alfie, much more on the experimental side with a sort of jazz swing groove in 5/4 in the drums, and we have a lot of instruments soloing throughout, using a lot of dissonant pitches and making a wide variety of squeaking sounds. Robert's vocal melody is also pretty unorthodox in itself, with certain notes that fit within the key and other notes that have a little bit more of a clash to them. Very cool follow-up to the opener. And then after that, we have easily my favorite track on this album, Marianne, written by Robert and Belgian guitarist Philip Catherine, one of Robert's most beautiful compositions in a long time, in my opinion. The harmonic movement is so beautiful and very colorful, and Robert's vocal melody is just so pretty, and I love how it's doubled within the guitar part. After that, we have Was a Friend, a very ominous track with an up-tempo swing groove in the drums with these really dark, long, held-out chords in the pianos and the keys. This song has a really great energy and an intensity to it, and the lyrics seem to be about healing old wounds, most likely about his former bandmates, and I think the placement of this track is perfect because the first three tracks are relatively upbeat in comparison to the openings of the previous two albums, and this track really adds a nice darkness and breaks things up a bit. A track like this sounds to me like something that could have been on Donde Stan. And then we have my second favorite track on this album, Free Will and Testament, an absolutely gorgeous song. In this one, he is talking about free will and the limits of it and how some religious people will use it as a way to explain the reasoning behind why bad things happen to good people, sort of like a cop-out. And he also talks about some of his regrets regarding Soft Machine and Alfie and how he feels like he's been a burden on a lot of people in his life. So a very personal and deep song, and it's nice getting to hear this side of Robert because prior to this album, it was much more focused on the politics more than anything else. And I also really love the slide guitar from Paul Weller on this. It always reminds me of Pink Floyd. Then after that, we have September the 9th, another track that features more of Robert's jazz and avant-garde influences. And I love how we're seeing so many different sides of Robert on this album. It's such a great blend. After that, we have another darker, more eerie track titled Alien. Really awesome chord progression in the piano with a great vocal melody that just flows right through it. The lyrics seem to be about Robert not feeling like he belongs and feeling like he can't find his place here on Earth. And this track has always reminded me a lot of the track I Just Wasn't Made for These Times by the Beach Boys. I can definitely see similarities between Robert and Brian Wilson with their outlooks and their viewpoints and how they view themselves in the world, just based on the similarities between those two songs. Really awesome guitar solo on this one as well. Another thing that I really love about this album, how we're hearing more guitar work than we do on a lot of the previous albums. Another nice little change of pace. And then after that, we have a slow ballad called Out of Season. I love the trombone work on this one. It really adds a nice dreary sort of sadness to the track. And then we have another favorite of mine, A Sunday in Madrid. Such a beautiful, uplifting track. I really love the ostinato part that repeats throughout the song. I believe it's on guitar, but it has such a unique sound to it that it's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is, so if I'm wrong about that, please let me know. In addition to that, I love the drones and the variety of different instruments that are happening in the background. There's so many little subtleties within these songs that add such a nice touch. And then after that, we have Blues in Bob Minor. a medium to up-tempo minor blues track that's a tribute to Bob Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues. I really love the dark vibe of this song and the fast vocal work, very similar to the vocal work that we hear on Shrink Wrap from Dondestan. And once again, great guitar solos on this one. Great hearing so much guitar throughout this album. And then we conclude the album with a short track written by Paul Weller titled The Whole Point of No Return. It has this really spacey, drone-like throat singing, with Robert playing some trumpet lines over the top as the piano develops into a little brief progression. So, yeah, like I said, I think this album is really amazing. I think it's his best album since Rock Bottom. It's got so many great features and collaborations, a really nice blend of a lot of different styles, but it's packaged in a way that feels very cohesive, and it's just loaded with great songs. So, yeah, amazing album. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have his 7th studio album from 2003 titled Cuckoo Land, and this might surprise some people, but I'm also going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album, and in my opinion, I think this one picks right up where we left off with the momentum of Sleep and gives us another very high quality piece of work. This is his longest album so far, with 16 songs clocking in at a total of 62 minutes, and for an album of that length, I thought it was incredibly consistent and really maintained a great momentum all the way throughout. This album was recorded over 2 years into the Bush presidency, and 9/11 had happened 2 years prior, so we have much more political matter on this one compared to Sleep, but we also have some really great lyrical contributions from Alfie, and there's also a nice small handful of covers sprinkled throughout as well, and I'd say that this album has some of the most diverse range of styles and influences that we've heard up to this point, weaving together rock, jazz, classical, folk, bossa nova, and Arabic, and they all complement each other very nicely, and the album has a very smooth and cohesive feel to it. I'd also say that this album has some of the most adventurous and unorthodox chord progressions that I've heard from Robert to date. We have a lot of the same amazing guest appearances that we did from Sleep, as well as the addition of Gilad Atzmon, Karen Mantler, Jennifer Maidman, and Yaron Stavi. It opens up with a beautiful track titled Just a Bit, which is a song dedicated to Richard Dawkins, commentating on how he believes that we all need icons to look up to tolerate the daily grind of life, whether it be religious or not. Very spacey, trippy synth sounds that create this really washy backdrop for the song with this adventurous chord progression that Robert's vocals just weave right through. A very cool opener. And then we have Old Europe, a slower tempo swing song about post-war Paris jazz music, referencing Miles Davis and Juliet Greco. Great change of vibe, and I really love the horns soloing on top of each other in this one. Then after that, we have an instrumental titled Tom Hayes Fox. This is one of 2 tracks that I could have done without on this album. I do feel like it was kind of early to bring in an instrumental at this point, and this song doesn't tend to excite me as much as everything else on here, but that's only one of 2 very minor critiques that I have of this album. And then we continue with Forest, a beautiful waltz with amazing harmonic movement and great guitar fills from David Gilmour that add just the perfect touch to this song. And this is the first political song of the album, with very dark lyrics referencing asylum seekers and different historical concentration camps. One of the standout tracks on this album, in my opinion. Then after that, we have the first of 3 Karen Mantler covers that will be on the album. The first one is titled Beware. I absolutely love this track. It might actually be my favorite song on this album. It just has such a great intensity to it, and it brings the energy up so much. And this song always gives me similar feelings to what I get when I listen to Rock Bottom, and I really love what Robert did with this song. The brass parts, the intensity within the drums, and him and Karen singing the vocal parts together in octaves, it just adds such a great drive to this song. A perfect cover song for Robert to pick, too. I mean, if I didn't know any better, I would have thought that Robert wrote this himself. It just sounds so much like a really intense track that Robert would write. So, perfect cover choice, I thought. Then we have the title track, Cuckoo Madam, another absolutely amazing song with some of the most fascinating and bizarre vocal melodies that I've heard up to this point, and very modern, innovative chord progressions that were inspired by Benjamin Britten as well, with absolutely incredible lyrics from Alfie, and Robert regards this song as the best lyrics that Alfie has ever written. And then after that, we drop things down a bit with Raining in My Heart, a beautiful instrumental piano arrangement of a song recorded by Buddy Holly. Really great cover, and I love the placement of this on the album because up to this point, we've been been hit with so much beautiful and intense stuff, and I love when this track just comes in and gives us a nice little mellow breather before the second half of the album. Then we pick up the intensity again with Lullaby for Hamza, a really heartbreaking song about an Iraqi woman whose son Hamza was born in Baghdad at the beginning of the first bombings in 1991, and what it must have been like living through that again in 2003. Very sad song, and I love the use of the trombone and the accordion. Really adds to the somber mood of this track. Then the song concludes with a little 30-second silent intermission at the end, and then we pick things up a bit with a jazzier number titled Trickle Down. We have a nice walking bass line with the drums swinging and a lot of instruments soloing on top of each other throughout the song over this steady 2-chord vamp in the piano. Really love the vocal melody on this one, very catchy. And then we have the other song that I could have done without on here, a cover of the bossa nova tune How Insensitive by Antonio Carlos Jobim. Definitely a great song and a bossa nova classic, and Robert's arrangement of it is fine, but this is one of those songs to me that I felt like it could have been left out and it wouldn't have really taken away from the album at all and would have shortened the album just a tiny bit. And then after that, we have the second Karen Mantler cover titled Mr. E, another beautiful cover and another track that sounds like it could have been written by Robert. It's clear that Karen was very influenced by Robert's writing style because the interesting harmonic turns that the piano takes and the very unorthodox and unpredictable vocal melodies are such a huge part of Robert's compositional style, and these covers that he picked just complement all of his sensitivities perfectly. After that, we have Lula Loop, another more jazzier track with these distorted guitar solos happening throughout and more beautiful lyrics from Alfie. I really love the brass hits in this song and the doubling of the vocal parts throughout. Very effective. Then we have the final Karen Mantler cover titled Life is Sheep, another one that sounds exactly like a Robert Wyatt song. I was actually blown away when I found out that all of these songs were covers, the Karen Mantler ones, because the vocal melody is so surreal, with certain parts going down the diminished scale, a very uncommon and very seldomly utilized scale in this style of music, but they use it so beautifully in this song, and it has such a mysterious, haunting quality to it that I just love so much. And Karen and Robert's voices complement each other perfectly. Then after that, we have Foreign Accents, another beautiful political track that mentions a variety of different political events by name. I love the use of layering on this song between the different instruments layered on top of each other, as well as the contrasting vocal parts with the lead part on top and the deep, throaty part more faintly in the background. An absolutely beautiful track. And then after that, we have Brian the Fox, a very slow, spacey track that has this really washy backdrop with filters and the synthesizers, similar to what we hear on the opening track. I really love when the trumpet comes in over the vocals, the 2 minutes into the track. Really nice mellow track to set up the ending of the album. Then the album concludes with an instrumental version of an Arabic song titled Lu Ahada Yalam, which translates to No One Knows. A very heartfelt, beautiful conclusion to the album with nylon string guitars, upright bass, clarinet, and soprano sax. An ending song that's very emotional and touching, and a beautiful way for Robert to show his solidarity to the people having to live through these devastating wars in the Middle East. So I think this whole album is incredibly strong. The Karen Mantler covers are all top-notch. Robert and Alfie's originals are top-notch. And like I said, with the exception of Tom Hayes Fox and How Insensitive, I love every single song on here, and I think it features some of Robert's most daring and ambitious music to date. So this one gets an S. Okay, and last but not least, we have his 8th and final studio album from 2007, titled Comic Opera. And I'm also going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album, and I think it is one of the best final albums that any artist has ever released. And some people might be surprised by this, but this is actually my second favorite Robert Wyatt album after Rock Bottom. From just beginning to end, I find this album to be such an amazing journey. Instrument-wise, it has much more of a rawness to it, whereas Cuckoo Land has more synthesizers and electronics combined with regular instruments that create more of a light and floaty sort of vibe, whereas this album is much more centered around raw acoustic instruments. For the personnel, we have a lot of the usual suspects from the previous 2 albums popping up, as well as a handful of new additions. The album is broken up into 3 different acts. Act 1 is Lost in Noise, Act 2 is The Here and the Now, and Act 3 is Away with the Fairies. Act 1 opens up with a beautiful cover of a song by Norwegian singer Anja Garbarek called Stay Tuned. Sorry if I pronounced her name wrong. But right from the opening of this track, I am loving the mood and the production. The instrumentation is beautiful with the upright bass, the drums and the guitar, with the woodwinds doing these beautiful moving voicings underneath Robert's amazing vocal work. Another cover that just fits Robert's style perfectly. A very powerful and gorgeous start to the album. Then after that, we have a very pretty song about love and deception titled Just As You Are, written by Robert and Alfie. And the idea behind this one was to capture the simplicity of the lyrics that are often found in country music. And part of the song is also about Alfie dealing with Robert's alcoholism and the fear of losing him because of it. Very powerful and emotional song, and I really love the alternating in the vocal parts, starting out with Monica Vasconcelos and then switching over to Robert halfway through. Again, I apologize if I pronounced her name wrong, but their voices just complement each other so nicely. And I love that how even though this track is more poppy and has some of those country elements in it, it still has a lot of moments that take some very dark and mysterious turns as well. So it's still very distinctly Robert, even within the influences that it's being derived from. Then after that, we have another very pretty song about widowhood titled You, You. Very beautiful vocal work on this one, and it has a nice blend of the live instruments as well as the electronics, similar to stuff that we heard on Cuckoo Land. Then after that, we have a follow-up track titled AWOL, which is a very sad song about Alfie's mother having dementia. And dealing with that. Really great chord progression in the piano, great instrumentation with the brass and the violin underneath. Very sad song, and up to this point, it's been a very emotional start to the album, with all of the originals so far dealing with something related to loss or the fear of loss in some form, which is a very deep and powerful way to bring in Act 1. And then Act 1 concludes with a beautiful dark instrumental titled Anachronist. A nice spot for an instrumental and a great contrast within the chord progression with some moments that are very pretty and melancholy, and then out of nowhere it'll shift into these really dark, eerie chords. A very cool sound, and one of the things that I've always found so appealing about Robert's sense of harmony. A lot of times you just have no idea what chord is going to come next and what sort of emotion is going to, pop up out of nowhere. The song eventually builds into a 4/4 swing with a walking bass, and Robert singing a melody doubled in the trumpet with these horn backgrounds. A very pretty instrumental and a great way to conclude Act 1. Then Act 2 opens up with an unexpected switch in mood with a beautiful piece written by Robert and Brian Eno. This one is a very pretty feel-good folk rock track, probably one of Robert's most straightforward tracks that he's ever written in terms of the chord progression and the song form and the melody. Very nice change of pace, but just like with Cuckoo Land, the contrast feels very fitting and it doesn't sound out of place at all to me. And then the mood changes pace again with Be Serious, a jazzy, bluesy track about religious fundamentalism and how Robert envies that they have their beliefs to fall back on during the turmoils of life. I love the vocal work on this one, the parts that are doubled in the octaves, as well as the staggered vocal parts and the background parts layered on top of each other. And although this is a much more straightforward song harmonically, Robert's vocal melody does still have a few moments where he hits an unexpected note that might stretch a bit outside of the key, so I love that element to this song as well. After that, we have another beautiful instrumental titled On the Town Square, a very uplifting feel-good song featuring the steel pan from musician Orphy Robinson. I've always loved the steel pan so much, and it was such a treat to get to hear it on this album, and it just adds such a good feel to this song. It also features an absolutely incredible saxophone solo from Gilad Atzmon, such beautiful lyrical soloing with just an amazing full sound. And then Act 2 concludes on a much darker note with the next three tracks, starting with Mob Rule, a spacey, down-tempo track that gives me a lot of feelings similar to Dondestan. Beautiful harmony and a great vocal melody, and I love how the voice is doubled within the keyboard. I'm not sure specifically what this song is about. The lyrics are sort of open to interpretation, but then the final two tracks from Act 2 bring in our first political pieces of the album, starting with A Beautiful War, written by Robert and Brian Eno, and this is another very sad song about the war in Iraq and the types of bombs that the US was using. I love the piano and the vocal work on this one, very melancholy, and it really captures the hurt in Robert's heart for everyone suffering from the war. And then we conclude Act 2 with a much more intense and dark track titled Out of the Blue, which is commenting on the effect of the bombs mentioned in the previous track and telling the story of a Lebanese woman whose house was destroyed. A very sad and powerful way to conclude the end of Act 2. Amazing instrumentation too. The combination of the synth with all of the horns stacked on top of each other just has such an intensity to it. And the final lyrics are some of the most powerful and intense parts that I've heard from any Robert song, when he keeps repeating the phrase, "You have planted all your everlasting hatred in my heart." So powerful, and when all of the instruments drop out for that last couple of words, it just gives me chills, and it's such a perfect conclusion to Act 2. Then for Act 3, we have almost all covers that are each done in different languages. It opens up with a song by Italian singer Giovanni Lindo Ferriti titled Del Mondo. Very pretty opener, really spacey with a beautiful sad vocal melody, and once again I love the use of the octaves in Robert's vocals, used sparsely throughout the song. Then we have a song titled Canción de Julieta, which lyrics are derived from a Spanish poet and playwright named Federico Garcia Lorca, who was shot during the Spanish Civil War. It's got a really heavy driving bass line in the Phrygian mode with this 11/8 groove in the drums, and a really eerie vocal melody over it. Very cool song, and really takes its time and builds beautifully throughout. And then we have an original by Orphy Robinson, who was the steel pan player from earlier in the album. This time he is playing vibraphone, and this song has sort of a modern classical sound to it with a lot of very unique tonalities and bizarre harmonic movements. Of all of the songs on this album, I would say this is probably my least favorite. I don't think it's a bad song, but it is probably the one part of the album where the momentum does die down a tad bit for me, and stylistically, it seems to sort of clash with the other songs in Act 3, but obviously Orphy Robinson is an incredible musician and his playing is amazing on this. Then after that, we have a short track titled Fragment, which to me it appears to be Just As You Are, but reversed, which is very cool. A nice little filler track. It has a really creepy vibe and a nice dark setup to the final track titled Hasta Siempre Comandante, which is a revolutionary song from the 60s written by Carlos Puebla, and also a song that was written for Che Guevara when he left Cuba. So a big theme throughout this side is South American left-wing revolutionaries, which is something that has been a huge part of Robert's life, and I thought having the final side of his final album being sort of an ode to that period that he came up in was very cool, and I absolutely love this song. It's so powerful and it hits so hard, and I really loved the reharmonizations that Robert did in the chords, especially when you listen to the original version. Very different but very tasteful, and the contrast between the darkness of the first section and then the groovy Latin second section with the montuno and the piano is really amazing, and to me it's just a perfect and very appropriate ending to his very last album. I'm not sure if we're going to see any more releases under Robert's name from this point on, especially since this album was in 2007, but anything is possible. But if this does really end up being the last studio album that he ever puts out, then I can't think of a better conclusion to an amazing 40-year career. This is an amazing album. It easily gets an S. Alright, we did it. So that covers all 8 of his studio albums, and like I said, if I got any information wrong or if there are any important details that I left out, please let me know in the comments. It is certainly possible that I might have misspoke at certain points or just let something slip. And please let me know where you agree and disagree. I can't say that I have any friends that are big Robert Wyatt fans, unfortunately, so I really haven't had the chance to nerd out with anybody over his music, so I would love to hear your thoughts. Please let me know. I am forever grateful for having discovered Robert because his music has opened up a whole nother world to me, and not only that, but his story of going through the life-changing circumstances that he did and coming out of it on the other side and being able to move forward in the way that he did and continue to create beautiful and unique music for the next 40 years while always staying true to himself and his core values and his beliefs, as well as him and Alfie maintaining their support for one another, is really something that's very inspiring and beautiful, and something that I think an extremely few amount of artists can say that they've achieved throughout their life. And obviously a huge amount of credit also goes to Alfie for being his support system all of these years and taking care of so many key roles in Robert's professional and personal life. And I do think it is debatable as to how much stuff we would have gotten from Robert if Alfie had not been part of the picture. So nothing but love and good thoughts to both of them. And yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you are interested in hearing my other album rankings, feel free to check out the link in the description, and it will also be in the comments as well. And if you are a subscriber who has never checked out Robert Wyatt, I would highly recommend it, and hopefully this video can kind of give you a starting point so you can kind of get an idea of where you might want to explore first. Alright, I think that about covers it. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.